Well, I want to welcome everyone and thank you for coming out on such a hot day. I drove up from Austerville, our summer house is on the Cape, and when it was 89 degrees on the water, I was a little surprised to actually find it 99 when I got off Route 128. Of course, I was surprised too about the amount of traffic. I couldn't believe, where is everyone going? But anyway, this is a lecture similar to the ones that I've been doing over a series of time. I write books on local history, but I also write books on businesses that we once patronized. I've done a book on the Baker Chocolate Company, Jordan Marsh, S.S. Pierce, and of course Howard Johnson. Howard Johnson was probably one of the best known chain restaurants in the United States. It went from Maine to Florida and from the East Coast to the West Coast. But you're all too young to remember, but do your parents actually remember Howard Johnson? It's a wonderful aspect. And seen here on the cover of the book, A History of Howard Johnson's, how a Massachusetts soda fountain became an American icon, it was something in some ways that chronicled our memories, our parents, and our grandparents, because the company was founded in 1925 by Howard Deering Johnson and continued by his son, Howard Brennan Johnson, right through to the 1980s. Well, Howard Johnson's was named after this man, Howard Deering Johnson. He was born in Dorchester, Massachusetts in 1899, and as a child, the family moved to Wollaston, which was a part of the city of Quincy. And there he attended school until the 8th grade. His father, who was a cigar jobber, had gone bankrupt, and as a result, he worked with him to try and recoup the family losses. Well, during that period of time, he would eventually enter into World War I. Well, Howard Johnson himself, as I said, left school in the 8th grade, and as a result, he helped his father, who had gone bankrupt. He was a cigar jobber, and he basically was to lose everything. Howard Johnson entered into World War I. When he returned, he decided he would actually buy a small corner drugstore. But in that period, he was somebody who was not only an entrepreneur, but he would create a logo in 1935, which actually would be something that branded his company. You might know that, Simple Simon and the Pieman. But the man who did this, John Eagles Alcott, a graphic designer from Islington, Massachusetts, would add a drooling dog. So it was something that people recognized immediately, whether you were on Route 128 or in California. And it says, Simple Simon met a pieman going to the fair. Says Simple Simon to the pieman, let me taste your ware. Said the pieman to Simple Simon, show me first your penny. Says Simple Simon to the pieman, indeed I have not any. Simple Simon went a-fishing for to catch a whale. All the water he had got was in his mother's pail. Simple Simon went to look if plums grew on a thistle. He pricked his fingers very much, which made poor Simon whistle. He went for water in a sieve, but soon it all fell through. And now poor Simple Simon bids you all adieu. Well, Simple Simon was simple, but the whole idea was Howard Johnson wasn't simple. He ensured the generational succession of his business with his son, Howard Brennan Johnson, who was the son of the third marriage. Howard Johnson would have 4 marriages. The first ended in divorce. And he said, I work 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. So of course my wife feels abandoned. His second wife would die shortly after childbirth, having given birth to his daughter Dorothy. The third marriage ended in divorce, and the fourth marriage, his wife outlived him. But seen here, between 1925 and 1981, these 2 men made Howard Johnson a name that everyone knew. Well, the story started in Wollaston, that same neighborhood the family had moved to in 1901, which was a part of the city of Quincy. Quincy had become a municipality in 1882, and between that time and 1925, the population would triple. Primarily, it was because of rampant building, but it was also because of the granite branch of the Old Colony Railroad. That allowed people to commute to Boston for business or for pleasure in the evening. And in the very center was the depot, at the Granite Branch in Wollaston. On the right-hand side, Howard Johnson bought the old Walker Barlow drugstore. And there, not only did he actually sell newspapers and magazines and cigars and cigarettes to the commuters, but he also had a wonderful marble fountain. And here he would serve not only refreshing effervescent drinks, but 3 forms of ice cream: vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry, but it was brought in. During that period of time, it was probably very good, but he wanted to have something that was a little more special. On the left-hand side is a man named Everett Porter, and he worked for Howard Johnson for over 41 years. And in that instance, Everett Porter and Howard Johnson would buy French freezers. And during the week, they would actually begin to experiment with all sorts of different ice creams. He wanted something that was not just creamy, rich, delicious, but with natural ingredients. They continually had failure. And I don't know about you, but do you like ice cream with shards of ice in it? I actually do. But Howard Johnson didn't. And he decided at that point he had to do something. Well, there was a rumor going around town that the man who had the most creamy, rich, and delicious ice cream was William Halbauer, who had Halbauer's ice cream on Nahant Beach. You can see him just to the right of the doorway. He was a German immigrant. He came here in the 1860s, and he would sell ice cream on the streets of Lynn. By the period of 1900, he opened this ice cream stand that was open 9 months out of the year. He made the best ice cream. And when Howard Johnson met with him, he said, "How is it that your ice cream is not only creamy, but actually can be scooped at a very easy rate?" And he said, "I can tell you if you buy my recipe." Well, the recipe was $300, which in 1926 was a considerable sum of money. And when Howard Johnson got the recipe, it didn't really differ from his mother's recipe one iota. The only thing was that Halbauer was using an 11% butterfat cream. Howard Johnson said, "Well, if it's that good at 11%, I'm going to make mine at 16%. So not only was it creamy, rich, and delicious, it was probably the most fattening ice cream on the market. Well, in 1931, this advertisement appeared in many different, not only advertisements on the wall, but in magazines. It said 28 delicious flavors. Howard Johnson's famous ice cream, made by a Yankee for discriminating Yankees. Well, in this instance, an ice cream cone was 10 cents, but it went the gamut of 28 flavors, one for every palate. It started here at vanilla, ended at pineapple, but they also had 5 sherbets as well. So many people began to realize in some ways, not only was it delicious, but people would come in droves to his corner store. Well, within a year, not only was he well known, but he decided at that time to open a small ice cream stand at Wollaston Beach. Going to the beach beginning in 1895 with Revere Beach became a public tradition. And Wollaston Beach, seen here in a postcard of 1910, did attract bathers. But look at the women in muslin dresses and parasols. Many people would simply stroll because sea air is invigorating. Well, walking on the sea was something that became not only a thing that people were dehydrated, but they wanted something cool to drink. Howard Johnson would rent this seaside shack for $300 for the entire summer in 1927. And there he did serve cool drinks, water, Howard Johnson's fried clams and French fries, grilled frankforts. Now, these weren't hot dogs. These were 100% beef, grilled in creamery butter and served in a toasted bun, as well as 28 flavors of ice cream. Well, remember, this was a small enterprise. He had 2 young men behind the freezer, and as they got an order, they would simply scoop an ice cream cone and give it to the customer. But it was said that in July of 1926, there were so many people that the Quincy Police Department was called out. People had to be queued in line. And in one weekend, it was said that he made $1,500 in ice cream cones. Within a year, he had opened one at Nantasket Beach and then also Revere Beach. Howard Johnson had done fairly well. And by 1929, he decided that he was going to open a restaurant. The ice cream stand was a great place, and so too wasn't the corner store. But he wanted to be in Quincy Square, really where he had been raised. Quincy Square in this postcard of 1950 shows the Church of the Presidents on the left-hand side and Quincy City Hall on the right. But in the distance was the Granite Trust Bank. Now, this was the tallest building on the South Shore of Massachusetts. It was designed by J. Williams Beale and Company and was built for a bank established in 1825 for the men who worked in the granite industry to save their money. Well, the Granite Trust had done extremely well. And seen here, the 11-story building not only had banking offices, but to offset expenses would have ground floor. I love these things. It's like, oh, here it comes again. It seems okay now. Okay. Just like at home when things don't work. Well, anyway, it was an 11-story building, and Howard Johnson wanted to have the corner restaurant just to the left of the entrance. Theophilus King was the president of the Granite Trust. Not only did he rent the space to Howard Johnson, but he extended a $50,000 line of credit, a huge amount of money, to build a kitchen in the basement and to have what was called the Colonial Room on the ground floor. Well, this was a place that was not only air-conditioned, but he would work with a woman by the name of Virginia Church to develop a menu. Now, Virginia Church was a trained dietitian, and she was living in Boston because her husband was attending the Harvard Medical School. They eventually wrote Bose and Church's Caloric Guide. I'm sure we all have it on our refrigerator. But the idea was she created things that she thought were highly nutritious, attractive to be served, but also something that could actually make Howard Johnson's name. She came up with the baked macaroni and cheese, chicken croquettes, roast turkey, and of course, hamburger made into a meatloaf. But Howard Johnson always insisted people try his 28 flavors of ice cream. And at a 16% butterfat count, I wonder what the dietitian really thought about it. Well, not only was it an important thing, but during that period, Howard Johnson did well. But he got a big break, thanks to Eugene O'Neill. In the period of 1929, O'Neill had written a play called Strange Interlude, and it was being performed at the Theater Guild of the John Golden Theater in Broadway, New York. It was a really outre play, though it won a Pulitzer Prize. During that period of time, it was something that was not only outre, but it was thought in some ways to be totally out of one's morals. And the plot centers on Nina Leeds, who is devastated when her adored fiancé is killed in World War I. Nina embarks on a series of sordid affairs before determining to marry Sam Evans. And while Nina is pregnant with Sam's child, she learns a horrifying secret known only to Sam's mother. Insanity runs in the Evans family and could be inherited by any child of Sam's. And realizing that a child is essential to her own and Sam's happiness, she decides to abort the child and conceive a child with the physician Ned Darrell, letting Sam believe that it is his. And the plan backfires when Nina and Ned's intimacy leads to their falling passionately in love. Well, you can imagine this type of a play. Malcolm Nichols, who was the mayor of the city of Boston, where the play was to come after New York, went to New York to see the play. After returning to his hotel, he made a call, and it was to the New England Watch and Ward Society. And the play was banned in Boston. Not only no theaters, but no auditoriums, a hall, or even church auditoriums would allow it to be played. And in that instance, the only place was the Quincy Theater. And the Quincy Theater, which was directly across the street from Howard Johnson's, got a big break. The 50-cent businessmen's dinners went to $1.50 because now people were coming out on the Granite Branch of the Old Colony Railroad in dinner jackets and evening gowns to actually see the play. Well, because the play was 6.5 hours long, there was not an intermission, but there was a dinner break. And guess whose restaurant was the only one in walking distance? Well, he did very well. And people began to realize in that instance that not only was the food good, but it was something that ensured Howard Johnson's success. Well, the play left on the third week of November of 1929 and went to Baltimore. And that Friday was Black Friday. And the Depression hit not only Quincy, but Howard Johnson. In that way, this was a building in some ways that people looked at as a solid place to invest one's money. But it was also something that this restaurant was Howard Johnson's pride and joy. He had a widowed mother, a wife, and 2 unmarried sisters and 2 children to support. So it was something he had to do. And people began to discuss this. And one of the ideas was with his best friend, Reginald Heber Sprague, that they discuss it in such a way that the company, which everyone had come to know not only to have 28 flavors of delicious ice cream, but very good food, would be something that could be franchised. Now, franchising is not new, but Howard Johnson eventually became known as the father of the franchise industry. Sprague lived in Wollaston, and he was hard hit by the Depression. But his father, who was a retired sea captain, lived in Orleans on Cape Cod. They went to visit him, and he came up with the ingenious idea that if they were interested in franchising, why didn't they build a restaurant on the edge of his lawn in Orleans? Well, the idea was the Sprague House stood at the junction of Route 6A and 28 as you entered from Eastham, and it was a magnificent sight that you couldn't miss. And it was something there in 1935 that the first restaurant franchise in the United States, under the auspice of Howard Johnson, would be opened. You can see the edge on the right-hand side of the Sprague estate. And if you know this area, it would be the site of a Christmas tree shop until fairly recently. Well, Howard Johnson would not only standardize the orange roof and turquoise blue shutters, but if you had a franchise, you had to buy the food, ice cream, and drink from his commissary, which initially was in Wollaston. So he was able to control not only what was served, but the quality of that serving because the cooks were trained. Well, within a few months, there was not only the one in Orleans, but there was one in Dorchester on what was called Old Colony Parkway. Now, we're all too young to remember when the Southeast Expressway was built in the 1950s. But prior to that time, the only way in or out of Boston was Old Colony Parkway. We call it Morrissey Boulevard today. So again, Howard Johnson was working with franchisees not only to buy a piece of land on a major road or intersection, but also a place where he knew it would not only have local residents, but the traveling public patronize his restaurant. The one in Dorchester opened in June of 1935. So if you didn't miss that orange roof, you also wouldn't miss the 28-foot-high neon sign at night. And in July of 1935, opened the one in Medford, Massachusetts. Now, Medford, just a little north of the city, has a place called Wellington Circle. And that was really built as an automobile road, and it was a true rotary at one time. It no longer is. But this restaurant was set in the middle of a rotary, and not only did you have roads going to Elfret and Chelsea, Charlestown and Boston, Somerville and Medford and Stoneham, but you would see an average of over 10,000 cars a day. Sounds ridiculous today, but at that time, the ascendancy of the automobile was one of the major reasons Howard Johnson's restaurants excelled. Every restaurant was built in a Colonial Revival style, and every restaurant had a parking lot for at least 100 automobiles. Well, seen here, standing in front of the restaurant that was in Canton on the Milton line, was something that not only was he proud of, but he had 5 architects on staff. And they would design these individual restaurants for the franchisee, who would then pay it off. And they would always have not only white Colonial Revival details, an orange slate roof, a cupola, which had not only a clock, but a light at night, and a weather vane of simple Simon and the Pieman. Howard Johnson was doing very well. And in that period, you began to realize with John Alcott, the graphic designer, they would brand not only every placemat, dinner plate, cup and saucer, glass, and even swizzle sticks with simple Simon and the Pieman, but it was John Alcott's idea to have the garish colors of orange and turquoise blue. Of course, they're interesting, especially on Nantucket, but you wouldn't necessarily combine them for a restaurant. Alcott was incredible, and of course, he had wonderful friends. Howard Johnson would work with Alcott for close to 40 years before his death. But he also had a friend by the name of Sister Parrish. Has anyone ever heard of Sister Parrish? Well, she would eventually open Parrish Hoadley, an interior design firm that became extremely well known. Well, during the Depression, she was hard hit. She'd been raised with servants, she had married and lived with servants, and of course, by 1932, she had no money. So she decided she'd decorate the houses of her friends who weren't as poor as she was. And she created, in some ways, some beautiful interior decoration. Howard Johnson knew her, and he would say to her, "Sister, I need your help. I need to have a waitress uniform designed." Well, she set to it, and she created a turquoise green suit, white collar, cuffs, cap, apron, and she was something, not only was she pleased, but when Howard Johnson saw it, he was mesmerized. He said to her, "What do I owe you?" And she said, "Not a penny, but I'll take a lifetime supply of ice cream." And she did. Not only was she a good friend of Howard Johnson, but there was also Norman Pemberton, who ran a roofing company in Quincy, and a man by the name of Frank Curry, who had a woodworking concern in the South End. Not only did Pemberton provide all of the orange roof tiles, but Frank Curry provided wide plank naughty pine paneling for the interior of the restaurants of the 1930s and 1940s. And here, on either side of a banquet, you can actually see the waitresses wearing Sister Parrish's design. The whole aspect was there would be a hostess that seated you, and you'd be given a menu that was not only with standard foods that you could get in Maine or Florida, but daily specials. And the whole aspect was that Howard Johnson's was a family-friendly restaurant. So it was something that attracted people of all walks of life. But many times we're in a rush, and we simply want either a cup of coffee or a piece of pie. And seen here, either we could go to the dining room or we might sit at the counter on a stool. And I love this because the stools actually had simple Simon and the Pieman and the drooling dog stenciled on the seat. But every child who dined at Howard Johnson would be allowed to take a lollipop. I remember this. It said lollipops for good little boys and girls. I had a maternal aunt who, I think, assumed she had a good sense of humor. And when I reached for it, she slapped my hand and she said, "Didn't you read the sign?" And I reread it. And I said, "Yes." And she said, "It's for good little boys." Well, the whole idea was, in some ways, when you went to Howard Johnson, no matter what you had, ice cream was something that everyone loved. This is a photograph from the early 1940s. It shows a young man holding 4 sugar cones as he scoops ice cream from the freezer. Yes, it was famous for 28 flavors, but you had to realize the flavors changed throughout the regions of the United States. New England might have things such as ginger, a little bit of our China trade heritage, grape nut, macaroon, peach, peanut brittle, pecan brittle. You would see more nut flavors in the South, and of course in the West, more fruit flavors. But the whole concept was, at 10 cents a cone, it was larger than anyone else's ice cream cone, and people loved it. Well, during the 1950s and 1960s, John Alcott was doing advertisements in nationwide magazines. You might remember Look and Life magazine. Well, these were full-page color advertisements. And it says here, Howard Johnson's ice cream, 28 flavors. The wonderful world of 28 flavors. The children sit on the stools and stare at the sign. Which flavor would they choose today? But if you look at the gentleman on the left-hand side, he holds an ice cream scoop in his hand. This was specially designed by Howard Johnson, and it was something that when you scooped it, you created a conical piece with a throat of ice cream. It was twice the size of everyone else's at a dime. But these children weren't just any children. They were Howard Johnson's family. In the center was his daughter Dorothy. She was the daughter of the second marriage. Her mother died shortly after her birth. On the right is Howard Brennan Johnson, the child of the third marriage. And on the left is his nephew Timmy. Now the concept is, I would smile if somebody offered me an ice cream sundae, an ice cream float, or even an ice cream cone. But these children were so important to Howard Johnson's advertising and marketing that they were on billboards. And the billboard would say, as they smiled, "We love our daddy's ice cream, and so too won't you." And the funny thing was, in the late 30s and early 40s, Howard Johnson got the concession for the turnpike roads. The Massachusetts Turnpike, the Ohio Turnpike, the Pennsylvania Turnpike, the New Jersey Thruway, and the New York Turnpike. Surprising thing was, he got the concession for the restaurant in Esso. Can you remember Esso gasoline? Got the concession for the gasoline. So you could fuel your car up, stop at Howard Johnson's, which also had clean facilities, and then have something to eat as you traveled, maybe on your vacation or to visit family. In that instance, by 1938, Howard Johnson was a multimillionaire. This is a man with an 8th-grade education. He would buy a fairly large house on Summit Avenue in Wollaston. This was a 6-bedroom house, 3 bathrooms, on a 1/4 of an acre of land. And it was really quite a lovely house. It still is to this day, though the land has been developed. And there he lived with his children, which he received in the 3rd divorce. Not only on the left-hand side is his daughter Dorothy, but his son Howard on the right. And he's sitting in the sofa in the house in Wollaston reading to the children the history of Howard Johnson's. Well, I got a couple of these copies on eBay. And when I buy for a book, I buy everything I can find. And it was a 40-page book. But remember, the company was only founded in 1925. I don't know what could have happened in 13 years. But they had a history, 3 pages long, triple-spaced, at a 14 font, telling the history. The other 37 pages were every location of a Howard Johnson restaurant or ice cream stand. Howard Johnson seemed to have the touch. Not only was he personable, but he was also somebody that had people working for him for years. And during this period, as a multimillionaire, he decided to leave Wollaston and to move to the next town over, which was Milton. Now, a house had come up on sale. It was on Brush Hill Road. We lived just around the corner on Canton Avenue until recently. And this was a simple house. It was 8 bedrooms, 12 bathrooms, a ballroom, library, parlor, dining room, 8-car garage, tennis courts, and 14 acres of land. Very simple. But it was built by N. Penrose Hallowell, a Boston financier. They lived in the Back Bay, but they also lived on Park Avenue in New York. Well, when his children boarded at Milton Academy, he wanted them to have a place to come on weekends so they could unwind, not only sleep in their own bed, but have home-cooked meals. That's the whole purpose of the house. It was sold to Howard Johnson in 1939 for $14,000. And according to the Milton Register, he lived there with a butler, a cook, a housekeeper, 2 maids, and a chauffeur. But the children boarded. The daughter was at Dana Hall, and the boy at that point was at Phillips, Exeter. And the idea was he bought it as an investment for business. And what he decided to do on that 14 acres of land was to erect marquees. Now you can see the edge of the marquee on the upper left-hand side. And this would be something that he would call frankfurter roasts. Now a frankfurter roast would allow all of us and our spouse to come. And we would actually ask Howard Johnson questions because we were prospective franchisees. Now, this would go out to hundreds of people, and they'd arrive by droves. And the whole concept here was that a franchise might cost you $4,000. Now, in 1940, $4,000 was a very nice house. But you had to realize, if you worked with Howard Johnson, not only did you have architects on staff, but you would eventually even attend an institute, 40 hours a week for 8 weeks, to learn how to run a franchise. Well, these Frankfurter roasts were in a tent, probably 4 times the size of this room. And of course, the only food served were grilled Frankfurters. But in the 4 corners of the room were open bars, and you could have as much as you liked. And of course, as we all know, alcohol loosens the tongue. I hope it loosens the pocketbook too. But as you see here in a photograph, Howard Johnson stands between 2 prospective franchisees. On the left-hand side is Irving Cotter, and he bought a restaurant franchise and opened it in Fairfield, Connecticut. But do you see the man on the right with his hands in front of him? That's George Larson. And George Larson bought a franchise, and he opened it here in Wellesley. Does anybody remember the Howard Johnson in Wellesley? Well, he owned it for 3 years. And of course, because you could only serve ice cream, food, and beverage that came from Howard Johnson's commissary, he had an Aunt Maud who made the best coconut cake imaginable, but he couldn't serve it, and he felt constrained. So he sold it back to Howard Johnson, and he opened his own restaurant. Do you remember the Pillar House on Route 128? So George Larson had as much wherewithal and sense as did Howard Johnson. But these people, within a year or 2, could pay off their debt, which averaged $17,000. Purchase of land, building of the restaurant, stocking it, but also you began to realize the $4,000 franchise fee. People loved it. By 1940, Fortune magazine was writing an article, "Who is Howard Johnson?" They saw the signs. They were on restaurants. They were on ice cream stands. It was in the newspaper. And they did an 18-page full-color advertisement. And in this instance, it said, "The boss, it's my favorite." Well, this disembodied hand holds a chocolate ice cream cone. Well, you can imagine Howard Johnson's chocolate ice cream wasn't anyone else's. This was made with real Belgian fudge, 16% butterfat, and was the best chocolate ice cream on the market. People couldn't imagine, how could he sell it for 10 cents a cone? Well, during that period of time, Howard Johnson's business acumen was something that was legendary. But I have to reiterate, he had an 8th grade education, which is a great example of entrepreneurs. Here, he hired a man that would run the institute. The Howard Johnson Institute, which it wasn't called that, but it was basically you had to attend. If you were accepted to be a franchisee, you went 40 hours a week for 8 weeks to learn how to run it, not only to train staff, but also to make the customers happy that they returned. The man on the right-hand side ran a statistics course, and he said to the men, fill up a tray, and you're going to eat it, of course, with whatever you think would actually be attractive and delicious for a customer. So say you put on some clams, French fries, coleslaw, a roll and butter, and you have a glass of milk. Well, if you put too many clams or too many French fries, it might not matter that day, but if you did it every week, at the end of the month, you were cutting into profits. The man would actually say, and it's really a statistical aspect, before you fill the plate, put the largest piece of parsley you can find, and then put the food on your plate. Do you always remember the parsley? It was always beautiful, but you couldn't eat it. Well, in that way, many people began to realize Howard Johnson had a method, and people loved it. Well, one of the things that he did was to have the largest roadside restaurant in the United States. In 1939, the federal government wanted to do a fair, which hopefully would bring the end of the Great Depression. And it would actually be the World's Fair in New York. The whole aspect was, it was in an undeveloped area in Jamaica called Rego Park. And that area would eventually have not only Howard Johnson's restaurant that seated 1,100 people, but it would also have a wonderful place that brought people to see the latest technology. Well, it was going to cost a small fortune. At that time, $600,000. You can imagine in 1939 what that would translate. It would probably be the equivalent of about $15 million just for a restaurant. But it was the largest orange roof in the world. It could seat 1,100 people, and it was open from 5:30 in the morning until 1 a.m. And there, you could have breakfast, lunch, dinner, and even late-night snacks. But because of the money, even he was daunted, so he needed a person to invest in this. And he actually hired a woman by the name of Lydia Gove. Has anyone ever heard of Lydia Gove? Well, she worked for her grandmother's company, which was in Salem, Massachusetts. She had attended Mount Holyoke and later Radcliffe, and she was treasurer of the company. Her father was president, but she was making $300,000 a year. And the company would actually make what was called Lydia Pinkham's Vegetable Compound. Now, as the advertisement says, men love peppy girls. This famous tonic helps to give you pep and energy. Well, in the early 1870s, the patent medicine entrepreneur Lydia Estes Pinkham created a mixture of black cohosh, pleurisy root, fenugreek, and of course other herbs, plus a measure of 40 proof drinking alcohol, and sold it under the name of Lydia Pinkham's Vegetable Compound. The women who bought it sought not only pep, but also relief from menstrual cramps, headaches, nervousness, hot flashes, depression, symptoms of menopause, and other female complaints. It survived FDA scrutiny in 1922, and there was so much alcohol in it, it probably cured every male ailment as well. But it sold, and many people looked at this as something that not only was profitable, but she invested $300,000. And here on opening night, Howard Johnson is in white tie and tails in the center, and Lydia Gove is just to the left. They invited 400 of their nearest and dearest friends. And not only did the people who had never been to Howard Johnson sit down to dinner, but they ordered from the menu. And you know, many Howard Johnsons would have lobster tails, sirloin steak, prime rib, wonderful things. But you began to realize that Howard Johnson was becoming accessible to everyone, whatever socioeconomic group you came from. Howard Johnson also realized that the aspect of this restaurant had to be marketed. So he and Lydia Gove created this gold dollar. It's not a dollar, it's a gold coin. And it had no monetary value. But it had the New York World's Fair on the obverse, and on the reverse was Simple Simon and the Pieman and the drooling dog. So it had no value, but if you had this coin and you stopped at the Rego Park restaurant, you got 10% off your meal. So whether it was a cup of coffee and a piece of pie or a full meal, 10% was a lot of money. So people were walking, taking the bicycle, automobile, or even a bus. And when they stopped at Howard Johnson's, they realized in some ways that even a dish of ice cream was something that they could actually parlay that savings on. Between 1939 and 1940, the World's Fair was for 2 years. These coins had a 14 million turn each year. So you can imagine the amount of money that was being brought in just with the Rego Park restaurant. Of course, if you didn't miss that orange roof, you would also see the tallest colored neon light in the United States. And here at the top, Simple Simon and the Pieman, and not only was the dog drooling, but the neon light actually saw the drool blinking all the way down. I love it. Howard Johnson's 28 flavors of ice cream. They had a grill, cocktail lounge, special luncheons, steaks, chops, chicken, fried clams, and special frankforts. People began to realize whether it was simply a snack or a meal, Howard Johnson was the place to go. Well, during that 1930, right up to the 1950s, Howard Johnson's Colonial Revival restaurants were on major roads. This is in Somerville, New Jersey. So you can actually see straight for New York, 63 miles, or left to Trenton, which was 7 miles. These were great places, parking, not only clean facilities, but the standard food. It never changed. So if you liked chicken croquettes, they were the same as here as they were in Florida. During that period, he opened them in major parts of the United States, and this is at the Bourne Bridge. Now, the Bourne Bridge dated from 1933 to 1935, and it, of course, allowed people not only to, I don't think people commuted for business at that time, but it allowed people to cross the bridge, especially tourists. The restaurant was right there. And when you arrived, why not stop for a plate of clams and French fries? It was a major feature, and people on the Cape absolutely loved it. But it was also the fact that Howard Johnson's was said to be America's choice. And the menu, which not only had delicious food and a standardized menu, had daily specials. So you really never knew what the daily special might be, but it was obvious going to be something that was quite attractive. But Howard Johnson, as I mentioned earlier, was a family-friendly restaurant. As early as 1935, they had created a menu just for children. Not only was it child size in portion, but it was child size in price. And in that way, the child could actually place his or her order from that menu. So here, maybe the little boy wanted the Little Boy Blue special, which was a grilled hamburger patty, mashed potato, fresh vegetable, rolls and butter, and ice cream for 90 cents. Or maybe the Tommy Tucker plate, sliced roast turkey, fresh vegetable, mashed potato and gravy, rolls and butter and ice cream for $1. But if they went there for breakfast, they were breakfasting with Simple Simon, and they offered the Pieman, Three Bears Bait, Jack Spratt's plate, and of course, Mrs. Spratt's plate. Children loved it, and it was something in many ways they felt special. They had their own menu. But during the period of the 1960s, they began to print menus like this, Howard Johnson's Big League Hat menu. And of course, it had the different things, small fry, Jack Horner lunch, the Simple Simon special, or even the Jack and Jill. After he or she had placed their order, the child could put this on their head. It was like a paper baseball cap. And it was something that was fun, and it would actually keep them entertained until the food arrived. But if they went for breakfast, after they had placed their order for whatever their choice was, he or she could, with the aid of twine or yarn, affix Mr. Pancake Face to their face and either entertain their family or torture the people in the next banquet. But these were things in a lot of ways that Howard Johnson did. There were high chairs and, of course, booster seats everywhere, because children were welcome. Well, in that instance, it wasn't just the customers' children, but Howard Johnson's own children, as I mentioned, were used in advertisements from the time they were toddlers until college, when they probably put their foot down and said no more. Here, in a detail of a 1948 advertisement, Howard Johnson hands an ice cream cone to his daughter, Dorothy. Dorothy's hair is always perfect. Her dress is beautiful. She has a beautiful smile. But I think the son got the wrong flavor ice cream. Well, these were things in some ways that if Howard Johnson's children liked it, why wouldn't mine? And as I mentioned about those roadside billboards, it was a big way to actually market the company. Well, during that 1950s and 1960s, John Alcott, who had hundreds of graphic design clients, of course, Howard Johnson was the largest, continued to do these full-page color advertisements. And it said that Howard Johnson was haven for the folks, but heaven for the kids. And the kids come in a perambulator with their holster and gun set, pogo sticks, walking sticks, and a scooter. So children loved it as much as their parents. So children, there were also teenagers. And you can also imagine teenagers know everything, and of course they're a little more difficult during those years. But here we have a young lady sitting in a jalopy applying makeup. And she says, "You men are all alike. Last night it was frankfurters and fried clams." And the little boy in the back says, "And those prices look good for my money, too." The little boy in the foreground paints the 28 flavors on the automobile. And the boy with his arm on the hood says, "What a dish. 28 flavors." Well, what comes to mind is a dish of ice cream, but I believe it's the dish in the automobile. And of course, brides and grooms in 1950 were very different. The bride says to the groom, "Can't you think of anything but 28 flavors?" And what does the groom say? "Nothing except those frankfurters and fried clams, the hurry-up service, and sensible prices." Just married couples were a little bit different 75 years ago. And a few years later, mother and father, and of course father's hair is receding as his hat shrinks, approaches Howard Johnson's in a red convertible and says, 28 flavors, 28 flavors, 28 flavors, that's all I ever hear." And the little boy in the back seat says, "And don't forget the frankfurters and fried clams, Pop, or the piggyback prices." Well, you smile, and a smile translates into sales. And in that instance, people looked at these as something that were well done, beautifully illustrated, and in color. During that period, Howard Johnson's would use these marketing and advertising to increase business. Well, during the 1950s, they came up with this one marketing ploy, and it was to encourage parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles to submit a child 12 years of age or younger, their name, address, and birthday. Because 2 weeks before their birthday, they would get a card in the mail. And I don't think we'd miss this. Orange and blue. And it says, "Howard Johnson wishes you a happy birthday and invites you to a birthday dinner." Well, what 12-year-old would refuse? But it had to be on the slow night, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and the child had to be accompanied by an adult. Of course, what person would go to a birthday party without both parents, 4 grandparents, aunts, uncles, and siblings? And it was said that the child, who enjoyed not only a free dinner, a birthday cake, balloons, and lollipops, would not only be happy, but Howard Johnson's had an average ratio of 11 people per birthday dinner on the slow night, a 63% return. Well, the whole aspect was, excuse me, Howard Johnson would always ask for people's opinions. And on the back of every postcard, or even this, it said, "To our patrons, we desire to maintain and, as far as possible, to improve on our high standard of food and service. And the entire satisfaction of our patrons is of vital importance. Your opinion will be a helpful guide. Comments or suggestions concerning any item of our food or service will be gratefully received." So say that the hostess was a little surly, or the waitress was slow, or the ice cream came half melted. If you actually wrote a note to Howard Johnson's and it sounded plausible, he would call you personally. Unbelievable. And if it sounded really plausible after your description of what had happened, he would send you a voucher for 6 free meals. It's a wonderful aspect to be listened to, but also to be rewarded. Well, in that way, people saw that Howard Johnson was serving food that everyone knew and loved. Seen here, their fried clam plate, 50 cents, included golden brown fried Ipswich clams, delicious French fried potatoes, tartar sauce, hot rolls, and butter. But these all came from the Ipswich River in Ipswich, Massachusetts, and they were called sweet as a nut. They were very small, full-bellied clam. And this was the way they were served, in a small bowl, along with, of course, tartar sauce and cocktail sauce. But they were provided by the Soffren brothers of Ipswich. These were 4 brothers who had immigrated from Kalamata in Greece. They worked initially in the fishery industry, but of course by 1930 they were dredging clams. They actually had a clam shucking shack that had women who were mostly Greek immigrants and spoke English haltingly, who would shuck clams 10 hours a day, and they were paid according to the weight of their tin. But these were delicious clams, and they would then be taken to the elder brother, George Sofran, where he put them into Howard Johnson tins that were 1 gallon. Now, the Sofran brothers were the sole purveyors of clams to Howard Johnson. They worked for no one else, and they had a 36-year contract. At this point, it would be taken by biplane from Ipswich to the commissaries. There was a commissary in Wollaston, Taunton, Brockton, and Rego Park, New York. The Sofran brothers in that instance were really quite important. The French fry, the fried clams seen here in a toasted roll were not only delicious, but you could also begin to realize that because the Ipswich River is just so big, they began to expand to Digby, Nova Scotia, and Hilton Head, South Carolina, to get more clams. Well, the clams they got were called hen clams. I don't know if anybody's ever had them. They're very good, but they were cut into strips, and they called them Tendersweet fried clams. And in 1951, the first clam strips were served to the American public. And you began to realize, George Sofran on the right and young Howard Johnson on the left, that this was something that revolutionized full-belly clams versus clam strips. But during that period, every one of the restaurants served the clams, but they also served roast turkey. They have it in the contract, 6 roast turkeys daily. And this said, take a tip from Rudy Valley, how to succeed in carving a turkey without really trying. Number 1, put the family in the car. Number 2, head for the orange roof. And number 3, order Howard Johnson's turkey special. Well, this was freshly carved turkey, real mashed potatoes, gravy with giblets, cranberry sauce, and of course a fresh vegetable, rolls and butter at $1.49. It was almost as good as if it was made at home. But the children were still paramount, and in the 1960s and 1970s, they began to do children's menus that had little stories, maybe the history of ancient Egypt, the history of Native Americans, the history of the metric system, and of course this was rocket science. The children were enthralled, but within these was also things like crossword puzzles. And it said, try to print these numbered letters in the like-numbered squares below. So if number 7 is a Q and number 4 is a U, if the child had done it correctly, he or she would spell the word quality. Well, what was Howard Johnson's food and ice cream if it wasn't quality? But the children loved these things. And of course, on the back of every one was the ice cream game. And it said, check the popular flavors as you try them. And the 28 flavors were there with 4 extras just in case. And if you had every one of those boxes checked, you got a free ice cream cone. Can you imagine your children wanting to play this every day? June, July, August, maybe 4 times a day? Well, everyone loved it. And I really do mean everyone. Howard Johnson in 1959 had a company that was worth $750 million. He stands on the Southeast Expressway in Dorchester at Boston Street looking at the logo, Simple Simon and the Pieman and the Drooling Dog. He handed the company to his only son, and the company would actually do quite well in the 1960s. Howard Johnson's son was well equipped to take over a multi-million-dollar company. He'd been educated at Moses Brown, Milton Academy, Phillips Andover, Yale, and the Harvard Business School. So he was really quite well prepared. And what he did initially was to put the company onto the New York Stock Exchange. If you liked it, maybe you'd buy a share of stock or a block. Howard Johnson paid without fail quarterly a dividend. And it was said that between 1960, when this was sold on the New York Stock Exchange, and when the founder died in 1972, the family sold $1.8 billion worth of stock. And you began to see in some ways that this was a blue chip stock that everyone knew and loved. He also would streamline the restaurants, and I did prefer the Colonial Revival restaurants, but he hired Rudolph Nims of Atlanta, Georgia, to create a low, sleek, modern restaurant. It still had an orange roof, and it still had a tower in the middle. Center entrance, on the right was the stools and counter, and on the left the dining room. And in this way, it was actually something that saved costs. But he was also a little bit reckless, and he decided to upgrade Sister Parish's waitress uniform. He didn't go to a local seamstress. He went to the House of Dior in Paris. And seen here, he actually hired it at a $25,000 fee. And the waitresses could vote upon haute couture. And this is what they ended up wearing. Dior has designed a new uniform for Johnson girls. They probably would have preferred a raise, but now they were wearing wonderful designer outfits. Well, in that instance, we realized that this was a place that not only was on the Massachusetts Turnpike, seen here at Newton and the waitresses, it was a place that would be on a roadside stand. It was everywhere. And people realized in some ways, by the period of the 1960s, the Sun, who didn't take competition quite well, would buy out companies rather than compete against them. Do you remember the Red Coach Grill? Well, it had 11 restaurants, and they had a red roof and a stagecoach as their logo. They had wonderful steaks and chops and seafood, but Howard Johnson bought them out. He bought out Mug and Muffin. And then he started the Ground Round in 1969. You could have a hamburger, and of course they encouraged you to eat peanuts before and throw the shells on the floor. You only do that when you know the housekeeper's coming. But the whole idea was this was something that was incredible. In 1951, they opened the first motel. This was in Savannah, Georgia. Of course, many people would travel from New England to Florida for the winter, and what better place to stop than a Howard Johnson motel? It had a radio, a television, a private bathroom, and a pool, and it was adjacent to a restaurant. What else could you ask for? This was something that showed that the entire American public loved it. Does anybody recognize this patron? Well, she's leaving the all-you-could-eat fish fry for $1.35, along with Ethel Kennedy on the left. Didn't matter who you were. Maybe you were a Greek billionaire, but you also realized that these were things that attracted people. Maybe it was the ice cream, or simply the fact that somebody was enamored of food. Howard Johnson's 28 flavors became a standard aspect. This was a major company. It went from the north to the south, the east to the west. And it did have ice cream that differed throughout the country, but the flavors were for every single palate. And here, in 1972, Howard Deering Johnson, the founder, and his son Howard Brennan Johnson share a scoop of ice cream from a Howard Johnson tub of vanilla ice cream. It says the site of the first Howard Johnson store opened by Howard Johnson on September 3rd of 1925. This commemorative marker was erected by Howard Johnson's through the courtesy of the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority and the city of Quincy on January 11th of 1972. The senior Johnson died a month later, and we realized in that instance that the son would continue the business until 1981. At that point, it was sold to what was called Imperial Group. It was a British conglomerate. They had mostly British pubs and motels. And what they did was to find that the books had been cooked. They paid $135 million. Remember, in 1959, it was valued at $750 million. And in this way, Marriott Corporation bought out all of the motels, but the restaurants had a legal entity. 1/3 were owned by the Johnson family, and they were closed. The other 2/3 were owned by franchisees. So the La Mancha Group, which was a conglomerate of financial and legal entities, continued the restaurants without Howard Johnson's food until the person retired. The last one closed 3 years ago in Lake George, New York. But you realize that Howard Johnson, with his silhouette of Simple Simon and the Pieman and the Drooling Dog, as well as the Howard Johnson restaurant, was something that was ingrained in the American public. The history of Howard Johnson's, how a Massachusetts soda fountain became an American icon, is a beautiful book, and I do have copies here. They're $20. But it gives the aspect with color photographs, over 125, that it's something in some ways that is not only an important business that is now no longer with us, but it's a delicious memory from the past. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Please. Yes, the Arbor Way. Yeah, the Arbor Way. When I do a lecture in Jamaica Plain, I use that photograph. I try to include things that are in the neighborhood. No, that's the funny thing. You could have an ice cream cone for 10 cents or a hot fudge sundae for 25. That's a pretty good price. By the way, happy birthday. It's close. Any other, please. That was the advertising agency. And did you know of John Eagles Alcott? Well, you know, he was somebody in a lot of ways. I've always looked at him as somebody that was black or white. There was no gray matter. Either you liked the man or you disliked the man. But I think in a lot of ways he was a very good businessman. And I would say this to people that would always say to me, my child is going to college. I had a secretary. I said, trade school is just as important. But he had an 8th grade education, and he was not only generous, I could go on for hours, but he gave $1 million to the Culinary Institute in upstate New York, which we're going to next week. And it's for scholarships. And he gave 10 $1,000 scholarships to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst for people that were going into hospitality. The man did a lot of things that were really good, but the whole idea was his son was not as attentive. Yes? Oh, because they did have one later for 28 flavors, and Dorothy inherited that one. Wow. Yeah, he later moved to another house in Milton, which was on Fairmount, and ironically, the bathrooms had orange and blue tile. But it was before my time, but people would tell me when they were children, they would go there and they get a pound bar of chocolate from Howard Johnson's commissary. Imagine a pound of chocolate. It'd be gone in 2 hours. Any other questions? Well, I do have copies of the book if anyone's interested, but thank you so much for coming out on a hot day.